The rain hammered lower Chrysum like angry fists against rusted metal. In the maze of forgotten alleys and broken dreams, where the desperate came to disappear, Shaw's workshop sat buried 3 levels down from the surface world. The storm had been raging for hours, turning the narrow passages into rivers of filth and despair. Shaw hunched over his workbench, shoulders tight inside a thermal coat that reeked of burned circuits and old sweat. The tools in his weathered hands moved with practiced precision as he carefully inserted a fake identity chip into the curved shell of a stolen eye scanner. This was his world now, forging new lives for people whose old ones had been stripped away. It had been 3 days since anyone had knocked on his reinforced door. 3 long days of silence broken only by the distant hum of ventilation systems and the occasional crash of falling debris. The last visitor had been a half-broken scavenger with melted optical implants and a handful of worthless credits, begging for papers that Shaw couldn't provide. But on this 4th day, as the storm grew fiercer and the sector vents groaned under the pressure, something different arrived with the howling wind. Tap, tap, tap. 3 soft knocks, barely audible over the storm. Not the desperate pounding of the starving, not the sharp rap of corporate enforcers. Something else entirely quiet, hesitant, like hope trying not to wake up fear. Shaw's hands stilled. His solder pen hissed and sparked as he set it down, the blue flame dying to nothing. He'd heard every kind of knock in his years down here. The frantic hammering of the hunted, the steady rhythm of smugglers, the coded taps of resistance fighters. But this sounded human, fragile, real. He pushed back from his workbench, joints creaking from hours of bent concentration. The workshop felt smaller in the storm's fury, shadows dancing in the flickering light of his work lamps. Every surface was covered with the tools of his trade, identity cards in various stages of completion, biometric scanners in pieces, holographic projectors that could make a face look like anyone or no one at all. Tap, tap, tap. There it was again. Softer this time, as if whoever stood outside was losing the courage to continue. Shaw crossed the cluttered room, stepping over coils of cable and stacks of blank ID cards. The airlock door was cold under his palm, vibrating gently from the wind that swept through the alleys above. He paused, hand hovering over the control panel. In his business, opening doors to strangers was often the last mistake people made. The external camera feed crackled with static, rain, and electrical interference, turning the image into a ghostly blur. But through the digital snow, he could make out a shape small, hunched, unmoving despite the storm raging around them. Shaw's finger hovered over the door release. Every instinct told him to stay inside, to keep working, to ignore whatever tragedy waited in the rain. He'd learned long ago that helping people only brought pain. The system crushed hope like insects, and those who tried to shelter others usually ended up crushed alongside them. But something about those 3 soft knocks wouldn't let him turn away. The door hissed open with a sharp release of pressure. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of rain and rust and something else, something that spoke of long journeys and longer desperation. She flinched at the sudden sound, pressing back against the alley wall as if expecting an attack. Her cloak was soaked through, hanging like dead weight around her small frame. What little Shaw could see of her skin through the dripping fabric was a soft blue-gray, like twilight over frozen water. Not human, that much was clear. Silvani, maybe, or one of the other outer colony species that the core worlds had discarded when the resources ran out. But she didn't beg. Not immediately. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, thread thin against the storm's roar. Please, I just need work. The words hung in the air between them, too delicate for the harsh world they lived in. Shaw found himself studying her more carefully, the way she held herself, the careful positioning of her arms, the way her eyes never quite met his. This wasn't the posture of someone looking for charity. This was survival, the quiet, dangerous kind that outlasted pity and promises. She took a step forward, just enough for the edge of her cloak to shift. That's when Shaw saw what she was really carrying. A child, bundled tight against her chest in thermal scraps that had seen better decades. The little one's skin was the same blue-gray as her mother's, but paler, almost translucent. Wisps of white hair clung to her small head, damp from the rain that had soaked through their inadequate shelter. Shaw couldn't tell if the child was asleep or unconscious, only that she made no sound, just watched the world with eyes too large and too knowing for such a tiny face. No one will hire me, the woman continued, her voice cracking not from pleading but from disuse, as if she hadn't spoken aloud in days. Not without papers. But I can work. I'll clean, carry things, scrub whatever you need. Just let me work. Shaw's hand tightened on the doorframe. Part of him, the larger part, the part that had kept him alive in this underground maze of broken dreams, wanted to shut the door, to seal out whatever pain and desperation she carried before it infected his carefully constructed isolation. He'd done it before. He'd learned to ignore the knocking, the pleading, the slow fade of hope outside his door. But another part of him, the part he tried to kill every day with silence and solitude and endless work, spoke before he could stop. You know what I do here? The woman hesitated, then nodded once. Her accent was soft, precise, careful, the way people spoke when they'd learned a language from books instead of streets. You forge names, she said simply. Shah's jaw clenched. Most people whispered that word like a code, a bribe, a dirty transaction in a world built on dirty transactions. But she'd said it like a hope, like it meant something sacred, like names were more than just data points in a system designed to erase people. Could you give me one? The question hit harder than he'd expected. In the pause that followed, Shah could hear the storm raging above them, the distant drip of water through rusted pipes, the soft wheeze of the child's breathing against her mother's chest. He stepped back into the workshop. She didn't argue, didn't hesitate, just followed, moving slowly and carefully as the door hissed shut behind them. The warmth hit her like a physical force, air thick with the smell of solder and rust and recycled protein, but still infinitely warmer than the storm outside. She blinked in the dim light, eyes adjusting to the workshop's chaotic landscape. Work lamps cast harsh shadows across tables covered with half-assembled electronics. Identity cards were scattered like fallen leaves, each one representing someone's desperate attempt to become someone else. In the corner, a small heating unit hummed quietly, radiating precious warmth into the underground space. The child in her arms stirred slightly, responding to the change in temperature. The woman adjusted her grip, breathing softly onto the little one's cheeks, trying to warm the blue-tinged skin with her own breath. Sit, Shah said, pointing to a padded bench against the wall, the only furniture in the room that wasn't covered with electronic components or identity forgeries. She obeyed without question, moving with the careful economy of someone who had learned not to waste energy on unnecessary movements. Shah watched as she gently unwrapped the child, handling her with the reverent care of someone who knew how fragile life could be. The little one's eyes fluttered open, silver gray orbs too large for her tiny face, reflecting the workshop's lights like polished metal. For a moment, those eyes locked with Shah's. Something hummed in the air between them, barely perceptible. Behind him, an old retinal scanner that had been deactivated for months suddenly clicked to life with a soft electronic chirp. Shah spun around, heart jumping. The scanner's display was blank, its optical sensors dark. Nothing. He looked back at the child, who blinked once slowly, with no fear in her expression, just awareness, just watching. What's her name? He asked, the question escaping before he could think better of it. The woman didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. She doesn't have one yet. Shah stared. In a city like Lower Chrysum, names weren't gifts from loving parents. They were bought, assigned, stamped onto flesh and digital files by bureaucrats who decided who got to exist and who didn't. A child without a name was invisible. No clearance codes, no oxygen credits, no food rations, no legal existence at all. She was a ghost in a system that only recognized the documented. He turned to his workbench, rummaging through the organized chaos until he found what he was looking for. A rusted toolbox pushed to the back behind stacks of blank identity cards and broken circuit boards. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a basic cleaning kit: brushes worn smooth by use, a filter wrench that had seen better years, a cracked respirator that still held pressure. Shah set the tools on the floor between them with deliberate precision. You want work? He said, his voice flat and businesslike. Scrub the ventilation grates. Start with the intake ducts. 1 section per day. You miss a section, don't bother coming back. She nodded quickly, understanding that this was more than a job offer. It was a lifeline thrown into deep water. Shah looked at the child again. Those silver eyes were still fixed on him with unnerving intensity. He turned away, pretending to check the cleaning supplies while he searched through a smaller box. His fingers found what he was looking for: a Juvenile breathing mask, originally designed for maintenance bots but small enough for a child. He tested the seals, checked the filtration system, then handed it over without a word. The woman took it with both hands, fingers trembling. Whether from cold or relief, Shaw couldn't tell. "What do you feed her?" he asked, the question coming out rougher than he'd intended. "Whatever I can find. Heat packs when I can afford them. Synthetic paste when I can't." Shaw crossed to the small food preparation station in the corner, little more than a heating element and a few basic containers. He ladled out a bowl of broth. Nothing fancy, just basic protein rations with salt and whatever nutrients he could afford. The smell was hardly appetizing, but it was warm and it was food. He set the bowl on the floor exactly halfway between them, not close enough to feel like charity, not far enough to feel like rejection. The woman didn't move. She just watched him with those careful, measuring eyes that had learned not to trust sudden kindness. Shaw turned back to his workbench, focusing on the identity chip he'd been installing. Seconds passed in silence, broken only by the storm's distant rumble. Then he heard it, a soft shuffle, the whisper of cloth against stone, a small bump. He glanced down. The child had crawled forward on her own, the thermal blanket dragging behind her like a tiny cape. She sat at his feet now, looking up at him with those unsettling silver eyes, as if she was measuring something inside him that he didn't even know existed. Shaw crouched down slowly, reaching for a nutrient biscuit from his workbench supplies. He held it out carefully. "Not scared, huh?" The girl didn't flinch. She just watched, taking in every detail of his face, his movements, his intentions. Shaw placed the biscuit gently in her small hand, expecting her to eat immediately most hungry children would have. Instead, she blinked once and held the biscuit back up to him, not begging, not asking, offering, sharing what little she had. With someone who had shown her kindness, Shaw's throat tightened. "Keep it," he managed, standing quickly and turning away. Behind him, the woman whispered something in a language he didn't recognize. It sounded like a lullaby, or maybe a prayer. The child crawled back to her mother, curling into the folds of her cloak, but her eyes remained fixed on Shaw's back. For the first time in years, Shaw felt something he couldn't name. Not quite guilt for all the times he'd turned people away. Not quite hope for what might come next. Just something, a crack in the wall he'd built around his heart, letting in a sliver of light he'd forgotten could exist. He reached for his solder pen, tried to focus on the delicate work of identity creation, but his hands shook slightly, and he found himself listening to the soft sounds behind him, the woman's gentle humming, the child's quiet breathing, the settling of two lost souls finding temporary shelter from the storm. He didn't ask her name again. Didn't need to. Something told him he'd learn it soon enough, along with all the other things that came with letting people into his carefully controlled world. The complications, the risks, the inevitable pain when the system caught up with them. But for now, in this moment, with the storm raging outside and warmth slowly filling his underground sanctuary, Shaw allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, some things were worth the risk. The vents were darker than she had expected, and far filthier. They stretched through the building's bones like arteries clogged with years of neglect, narrow passages lined with grime that clung like ancient smoke. The first time she crawled inside, Elu strapped securely to her back and breathing through the modified child mask Shaw had provided. The metal grating scraped against her knees and palms with every movement. The work was brutal. 10 minutes in, and the filth under her fingernails felt permanent. 20 minutes, and her back ached from crawling hunched over. An hour, and every breath tasted of rust and decay. But she didn't stop, couldn't stop. This job, this chance, was the only thing standing between them and the alley's exposure. Hunger, the constant scans by security drones looking for undocumented aliens to process and deport. Here, in Shaw's buried workshop with its smell of scorched metal and cold rations, she was invisible in the best possible way. She was working, earning her place, proving her worth. That meant everything to someone who had been stripped of identity, of purpose, of the basic right to exist. Elu bore it all without complaint. Even when the ventilation shafts echoed with distant mechanical sounds and the sharp ping of falling rust, she made no sound. She just clung tightly to her mother's shoulders, small hands grasping the fabric straps Shaw had rigged to distribute the child's weight more evenly. Elu's presence was negligible in pounds but infinite in meaning. The reason for every scraped knuckle, every swallowed complaint, every hour spent breathing recycled air thick with industrial dust. The morning routine had quickly settled into silence. Shaw would hand over the cleaning supplies: brush, solvent, filtration cloth without a word. She would nod, take the tools, and disappear into the network of ducts that kept the underground complex functioning. No small talk. No questions about her past or her plans. Shaw wasn't the kind of man who wasted words, and she appreciated that. More than he could know, she had known men who spoke constantly, filling every silence with empty phrases and hollow promises. Men who whispered sweetly while their hands signed deportation orders. Men who smiled while they stripped away everything that mattered. Shaw's silence felt honest, the quiet of someone who had learned that actions spoke louder than words, that small kindnesses mattered more than grand gestures. She worked steadily through the morning hours, moving through the low ducts with methodical precision. Each section of mesh had to be removed, cleaned, inspected, and replaced. The work required crawling through spaces barely wide enough for her shoulders, pushing through air that hadn't been properly filtered in months, scraping away fungal growths that crumbled at her touch and left her coughing despite the respirator. Every 20 minutes, she would pause to check on Elu, adjusting the child's breathing mask, wiping condensation from the inside of the face shield, making sure the straps weren't cutting into small shoulders. Elu endured it all with the patience of someone far older than her apparent age, watching the world through the clear plastic of her mask with those unnervingly intelligent silver eyes. In the main room, Shaw maintained his usual intensity. The blue flicker of his soldering tools cast shifting shadows across his workstation as he carefully crafted new identities for people whose old ones had been erased by bureaucracy or circumstance. But she could feel his attention, the way his head would twitch slightly whenever her tools slipped or the ductwork creaked under her weight. He was listening, she realized, pretending not to care while caring anyway. It was nearing the end of the second day when everything changed. She was deep in a particularly narrow section, working to clear a mesh screen clogged with something that might have once been organic, when she heard it, a cough. Sharp, high-pitched, distinctly wrong. She froze, her hands stilling on the cleaning brush. The sound came again, longer this time, Elu's tiny chest convulsing with the effort. What started as a brief hack quickly became something wet and desperate. Her heart hammered as she began the careful process of backing out of the crawl space, every second feeling like an hour. Her knees scraped against metal edges as she reversed course, following the beam of her flashlight back toward the main chamber. Behind her, she could hear Elu struggling, small sounds of distress that cut through her like physical pain. Finally, she emerged from the vent system, immediately reaching up to check on her daughter. Elu's face was flushed despite the blue-gray tone of her skin, and her lips had taken on a grayish tint that spoke of oxygen deprivation. The child's eyes were glazed, unfocused, and when she tried to breathe, it came out as a rasping wheeze. Shaw was already standing, his work forgotten. He'd heard the coughing from across the room. "She's burning up," he said, his voice sharp with concern. The woman didn't speak. She pressed her forehead against Elu's, closing her eyes as if she could somehow absorb the fever through skin contact, draw the heat and pain into her own body. "She's been breathing spores," Shaw continued, moving toward his supply cabinet. "The ducts are filthy. I should have cleared them first, before she needs warmth," the woman interrupted, her voice hoarse with worry and rest. Shaw was already rummaging through a drawer filled with medical supplies, mostly expired supplements and emergency medications he'd acquired through the black market. His fingers found what he was looking for, a patch designed to combat respiratory infections. It wasn't meant for children, especially not alien children, but it was all he had. He tossed the medication her way. "Put it on her back. Press hard until it clicks." She obeyed without hesitation, her hands steady despite the fear in her eyes. When the patch sealed with a soft hiss, Elu twitched once, let out a small whimper, and went limp against her mother's chest. Her breathing eased, though it remained shallow and labored. "She needs more than this," the woman whispered, her voice breaking slightly. Shaw didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crossed to the back of the workshop and knelt beside the main heating duct. The panel came away with a scraping sound, revealing the building's circulatory system, pipes and conduits that carried warmth and power throughout the underground complex. A minute later, The soft hum of redirected airflow filled the room. The temperature began to rise almost immediately, warmer air flowing steadily toward the corner where the woman sat holding her child. "I've rerouted the heating coil to your area," Shaw said, not looking at them as he sealed the panel. "It's not much, but it's enough," she replied. She didn't thank him. Gratitude was a luxury neither of them could afford in a world where help often came with hidden costs. But her eyes briefly met his, and in that moment, something passed between them. Not quite trust, not yet, but understanding, recognition, the acknowledgement that sometimes in the darkest places, people still chose to be human. Shaw returned to his workbench, but the soldering iron remained cold in his hands. He found himself listening to the sounds behind him, the woman's gentle humming, Elu's gradually steadying breath, the soft shuffle of someone making a nest out of thermal blankets and borrowed warmth. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside Shaw's workshop, something had shifted. The space felt different now, less like a hideout and more like a home. Less like a place to disappear and more like a place to begin again. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Shaw didn't mind the company. In them it was something older, recognition of pain, of shared silence. He didn't like how much it stirred in him. That night she didn't work. Shaw didn't ask her to. She sat beside the girl who was sleeping fitfully beneath the threadbare blanket, and ran her fingers slowly through wisps of white hair, murmuring in a language he didn't recognize. He kept to his bench tools, clinking softly, but he wasn't realificus. She was humming a low looping tone, not a melody, more like a modulation. It synced with the faint hum of the workshop's systems. It calmed the child, calmed Shaw too, though he'd never admit it. Sometime later, when the lamps had dimmed into their nightly low glow and the noise of the world above had faded into the usual drone of a city forgetting its underlayers, he heard tiny footsteps, software uneven. He looked down from his bench. Elu stood there, a blanket trailing from her shoulders like a fallen wing. Her eyes were half-lidded, cheeks still flushed. In her hands she held the cracked shell of an old data tag, burnt, useless. She looked up at him. Tao. She said the name was mangled. Her tongue wasn't made for their consonants, but the sound was clear. Shaw blinked. The girl held out the tag. He crouched, slowly took it. "Thanks," he murmured. She smiled just slightly and leaned her head against his knee. "Not for warmth, just contact." Shaw froze, then let his hand rest gently atop her head. She didn't move. A moment later the woman's voice broke the quiet. "She doesn't do that." He looked up. She was watching from the blanket nest, arms around her knees. "She doesn't touch anyone." Shaw didn't know what to say, so he didn't say anything. He let his hand rest on the girl's hair a few seconds longer, then stood careful. The girl didn't cry when he moved away, just picked up a wire scrap from the floor and started tracing circles in thetis. "She'll be all right," he said. The woman nodded, but didn't answer. "You ever going to tell me your name?" he asked. She hesitated. Then quietly, "It's not Safi." Didn't push. That night, as he lay in the corner of his makeshift bunk, staring up at rusted ceiling beams and half-dead vents, he realized he wasn't sure what scared him more, that the child had smiled at him or that he wanted to protect her for no reason other than that smile. The ducts would still need cleaning tomorrow, but tonight he rerouted another heat line toward their bedroll without saying a word. Elle's fever broke just before dawn. The air inside the workshop was warmer than usual, humming gently from the redirected heat lines Shaw had patched together the night before. The lights above flickered into their dim morning phase, more a suggestion of daylight than the real thing. But it was enough to cast pale illumination over the girl's face. Her breathing was deeper now. Her color had returned slightly. The rasping had dulled into the faint, wet sound of recovery. The woman lay beside her, half curled on her side, a hand resting protectively over the child's ribs. Her eyes had been open most of the night, but now, for the first time since she had entered Shaw's door, they were closed. Shaw didn't move. He sat in his chair at the edge of the workbench, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the little bundle of blue skin and white hair nestled under threadbare blankets. He hadn't slept, not truly, just drifted on and off, mind caught in quiet spirals. He didn't know the woman's name, still didn't know where she was from or who she was running from, but the way she held the girl, the way she endured, scraped, obeyed, and never once begged for pity. He knew enough. She was surviving. He'd seen what that kind of quiet endurance did to people, what it took. He pushed to his feet, his knees cracked faintly, drawing a slight flinch from the woman. Even in her half-sleep she didn't open her eyes, but he saw her hand curl reflexively around the child's waist, pulling her a little closer. He turned to the back corner of the room where the water line ran through a rusted sink panel. Cold water filtered from above through 3 layers of repurposed industrial mesh, not clean but passably filled a small metal bowl, then dropped a cloth inside and waited until it had soaked through. Then, slow and careful, he carried it back across the room. As he crouched near the child, the woman stirred again, this time wakefully. Her eyes flicked open, scanning for danger before settling on Shaw. He held out the bowl. She should be cooled down gradually. Keep her drinking. If she wakes up. The woman took the bowl without a word. Her fingers were steady, but her jaw tightened slightly. She dipped the cloth and wrung it out with practiced care, then pressed it gently to the child's neck. Shaw stood again. He hesitated. You didn't sleep, he said quietly. Didn't need to. You do now. She gave him a sharp glance, not quite defensive, but not receptive either. You'll be no use to her if you collapse. He gestured toward the back mat. Rest. I'll watch her. Her lips parted slightly as if to argue, but then closed again. For a moment she sat motionless, eyes scanning him as if weighing a dozen unspoken risks. Then finally, she shifted her weight and lay down beside the girl. She didn't take her hand off the child's back, but she let her body rest, let her eyes fall close. Shaw watched them for a moment longer, then returned to his bench. He worked in silence, soldering a circuit board for a proximity scanner that would never be sold, not because it didn't work, it did, but because the people who needed it couldn't afford it, and the ones who could didn't want gear made in lower. He was halfway through rewiring the emitter when a soft shuffle caught his ear. He turned. The girl was sitting up. Aganellu. He didn't know why he'd started calling her that. It wasn't a name the woman had given, but it had settled into his mind as if it belonged to Ella. The sound of something small and unbroken. She tottered on unsteady feet toward his bench, dragging the blanket behind her. When she reached him, she didn't speak, just held out a small gear, rusted, bent, like she was giving him a treasure. Hedekit, thanks. She blinked, then sat on the floor at his feet, cross-legged, her tiny hand reaching into the wire bend beside the workbench. He let her stay. The woman slept for nearly an hour. When she woke, she bolted upright, eyes darting around the room until they locked on her daughter and froze. Elu was holding a spanner, too big for her hands, tapping it gently against her knee in perfect rhythm with the ticking of Shaw's shoulder timer. The girl looked up at her mother and smiled, then looked back to Shadow. She said again. This time the woman's face changed. Not fear, not surprise, anything older, something that trembled just beneath the skin. Shaw straightened from his seat. She found the gear. Ben Hezed didn't break anything. The woman didn't answer. She stood slowly, then crossed the room and knelt beside her daughter. Elu looked up, reached out, and pressed the spanner into her mother's palm like a peace offering. She took it, her fingers closed around the cold metal, but her eyes were elsewhere on Shaw's share members. Sounds, she said softly. Patterns. Voices. He nodded. She's sharp, she mimics, but only things she likes. That sat between them for a moment, heavier than it should have been. Then, she added almost too quietly to hear, I think you remind her of someone. Shaw didn't know how to answer that. He didn't ask who. Instead, he walked over to the storage panel, retrieved a packet of nutrient paste, and tossed it toward her. She needs food, not just heat. The woman caught it one-handed, tore it open, fed it to the girl in small, careful bites. Elu chewed slowly, eyes flicking from her mother to Shaw and back again. She was watching, always watching. Later that day, as the woman scrubbed at a wall grate Shaw hadn't asked her to touch, he watched her from the corner of his eye. Her movements were stiff. Her left arm trembled slightly when she reached too far. He noticed her suppress a Kotweiss she hadn't eaten. He opened a ration tin and slid it toward her. No words. She paused, then ate quickly but not ravenously. Her shoulders dropped slightly afterward, as thaw tension had been holding her spine straight for hours. Where did you learn to scrub ductwork? He asked, not looking at her. She hesitated. Factory maintenance before the shutdown. Official. Her jaw tensed. Not anymore. He didn't press. She didn't volunteer more. But that was more than she'd said about herself since she arrived. By the time the lights dimmed again, and the heat coils ticked back into standby, Elu was asleep in a pile of rags that smelled faintly of machine oil and warmth. The woman sat beside her, still and watchful. Shaw stood by the doorway, arms crossed. You still want that name? He asked. She looked Up slowly, yes, she said, but not for Freak nodded, then turned back toward his bench behind him. He heard her whisper not to him but to the child, "We're staying." 3 words, nothing more, but they echoed louder than anything else that night. It started with the sound of rain again, soft, rhythmic tapping against the pipes above their heads, like a memory refusing to leave. The workshop was dim, the lamp still. In standby mode, Shaw sat on a cracked stool near his bench, sipping from a dented metal cup that had long since lost its polish. The inside was stable now, enough to keep the damp off their skin, enough to keep Yel's breathing regular as she napped. Against a coiled thermal blanket, Callan knelt beside her, gently brushing back strands of white hair from the child's forehead. "She's stronger," Shaw said without turning. "She's sleeping deeper now, real sleep." Kane nodded, her palm still resting lightly on Yel's side. "She hums in her sleep sometimes," she whispered. "When she's calm, she doesn't know the words, just the rhythm." Shaw took a slow sip. "Might be how she remembers the part she can't say yet." Callan smiled faintly, but it didn't last. Her face settled back into quiet focus, like a wall rebuilding itself. Shaw leaned back against the bench. The silence between them stretched, not uncomfortable, but full of something unspoken. "You said once you filed a grievance," he murmured, "about your mate. Want to tell me what really happened?" She didn't answer at first. Instead, Kane shifted to sit cross-legged on the floor, her back pressed to the wall, arms around her knees. She watched the flickering light in the duck grills for a long moment, then closed her eyes. "I told them his name was Solon," she began softly, "but they said there was no record. I stood there holding his badge, his tools, everything he wore, and they said he never existed." Shaw didn't interrupt. "I met him in Dock Unit 9. He worked Ray entry base, stabilizing loadout frames during atmospheric pressure shifts. It's dangerous. You learn fast or die." Helen then taught others, took pride in it. "Not many Silvani got assigned to primary zones. He earned it." Her voice hooked once barely. They didn't like that. Her eyes opened slowly, not wet but colder now. "There was a day storm, pressure too high, faulty alert system, a container breached. Solon and 3 others locked it down before it imploded, saved half the dock. 2 days later, vanished. No warning, just gone." She swallowed. "I found the container logs. It tried to report it, called in every favor I had. A human dock chief pulled me into his office and told me plainly, 'You're no authorized to raise incident reports. You're listed as a dependent.' Shawwin said so. They erased you too. They wiped my clearance, flagged my ID for inconsistency, locked my biometric code. On day I had a name, the next I didn't." She looked over at Elu, still sleeping. "I didn't even know I was pregnant until the week after, when I tried to scan into a clinic. The system told me I didn't exist. I had to barter for an old Silvani midwife in the sectors, gave her what little I had left." Shaw exhaled through his nose, and Elu Kalan smiled. Again, just barely. "She came out small, quiet but strong. She clung to me like she ouerdine you. She'd have to." Her fingers tensed around her knees. "They tested her a few months later. Public health units sweep even the undersectors. Sometimes a nurse ran her blood through a cross-index and flagged her neural patterns. Said she weighs irregular, too slow to adapt, not compliant with developmental ranges." "That's what they told you?" Shaw asked. Kane nodded. "They recommended observation Earlton in a developmental lab unit, said it was for her benefit. I saw Theskin before they took it back. There were markers in her sequence I didn't recognize. Not Silani, not human." Shaw stared at the wall, jaw tight. "She's a hybrid," he said quietly. "More than Thatch is undocumented and unclassified. That makes her dangerous to them." There was a long silence. Then Shaw stood, walked toward the wall. He unlocked a metal drawer beneath the intake fan and pulled out a chip shell smaller than a finger. "Do you want her to have a name?" he asked. Kalan looked at him, startled. "She does. A legal one they can't take." Her throat worked, but no words came. Shaw held up the chip. "You've earned it." Kalan slowly rose to her feet, crossed the room. She didn't take the chip right away, just looked at it. "What will it say?" "Silu, daughter of Kalan Vis." Kalan blinked. "You gave me back my family name. You said you wanted to keep it." She took the chip with trembling fingers, stared at it like it might vanish. "I haven't seen my name in print in over 3 years," she whispered. "And Shaw?" she asked, suddenly looking up. He hesitated. "What about you?" He turned away. "Burned my name the day I let a child die because of a quota." Callan stepped forward, voice soft. "You were an id register?" "Yes." "You forged records?" He gave a bitter laugh. "I didn't at first. I just didn't delete the ones I was supposed to. Then I started altering them, hiding threads, splitting family chains so they couldn't be relocated." Kalan studied him for a long moment. "Did you ever get caught?" They gave me a choice, eraser or silence. I took both. She looked down at the chip in her hand. But you're still here helping to late for most of them, he said, but maybe not for you. A silence settled again, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was full of something else, recognition, perhaps a thread of belonging beginning to stitch across the quiet. A faint noise stirred them, a lush shifting in the blankets. She sat up, blinking at the low light. Her small voice broke the stillness. Tao, she said softly, reaching toward Shaw. He crouched beside her. Hey, he said, brushing her hair gently. Callan watched, still holding the chip. She remembers sound better than faces, she said. Your voice calms her. Shaw nodded but didn't speak. Elu reached out, resting her tiny palm against his chest. Callan's eyes glistened, then not with tears but with a kind of fierce, tender relief. Deserves more than what this city tried to make her, she whispered. Shaw looked up. So do you? Callan steps forward. We stay together, she said, until the end. He rose to meet her eyes, no hesitate, until the beginning. And in that moment, beneath rusted beams and flickering light, two people once erased stood still, no longer ghosts but present, and a child once deemed unworthy of Annam had both. The days that followed unfolded like breath returning after drowning. No alarms, no pounding at the door, just the low whir of ventilation and the faint shuffle of small feet on concrete. A rhythm formed in that silence, fragile, almost sacred. They didn't speak of it, but it shaped the air. Callan moved through the space with a quiet steadiness. She still cleaned the ducts, sorted cables, and cataloged fragments off burnt hardware, but her movements had softened, not slower, not less disciplined, but no longer braced for the worst, as though something in her had dared to believe she wouldn't be turned away tomorrow. And Shaw, he noticed when she passed him tools without hesitation, when she left her boots near the caught instead of by the door, when eluded across the workshop on wobbling feet. And Callan didn't snatch her back but watched as the girl reached for his coat with small curious fingers. He didn't stop her. She would sit by his feet some evenings, stacking washers and discarded sensor rings into awkward towers, humming softly, barely audible yet almost in tune with the buzzing bench equipment. And then one morning, as he adjusted a cracked retinal encoder, Callan appeared beside him. Her hands were empty, her eyes steady. I'm ready, she said. He didn't ask for what. He didn't need to. She was holding the chip shell he'd offered her days ago. He studied her expression for a beat, not a flicker of fear, only the quiet weight of decision. Sit, he said, motioning her toward the bench terminal. She did. He initialized the blank registry and began entering the data: name, approximate origin, parental anchor chain. No forgeries this time, no shortcuts. This one mattered. Ask screen pulsed with each confirmation. Callan spoke softly, barely above the hum of the terminal. Let her name be hers. He paused, looked up. Elu, he asked. She nodded. Not a designation, not a number, just that. Shaw entered the request. No system birth record, but the bond chain traced directly to Callan Virus, a name the system hadn't seen in 3 years. He hesitated, then added one more line: a parental guardian, primary active. When the imprint process completed, 2 cards emerged from the slot, one for Callan, one for Elu. Kane picked them up slowly, as if afraid they might burn her fingers. They feel real, she whispered. They are, Shaw said. She stared at them, unmoving. We exist now. He nodded, but Themant didn't last. That evening, while Shaw worked to boost the signal clarity on a Jury Ridge scanner, Callan stood by the door, still in alert. They're getting closer, she said. Shaw set his tools down. How do you know? I went out just for air to levels up. No lights, no insignias. They moved like ghosts, quiet, fast. Wiped a food stall in 30-second. Seep sweepers, he muttered. Ghost patrols. They map first, then. Irasikalin's voice lowered. They're not just looking for undocumented bodies, they're looking for someone specific. He turned to face her fully. She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped closer to Elu, who was sitting near the heating coil, drawing shapes in dust with a bolt head. I think it's her, Callan said. Shaw's stomach tightened. She's not just undocumented, Callan went on. She's unclassified. They flagged her. Neuralsync once labeled her as aberrant. I didn't understand what it meant then, now I do. He stood still, listening. They called it control. Her profile couldn't fit her into the prediction grid, so they marked her, and now they want her back, Shaw said. Callan nodded. Not to register her, to remove the variable. Silence dropped between them. Then Shaw crossed the room, pulled open a drawer under the main console. 3 blank data shells set inside. He grabbed them, inserted the first, and began deleting. Not just her record, all of them. Every name, every ID thread he'd ever saved, every forged birth certificate, relocation string, guardian bond, the lives of dozens of others who had come before her. Shaw, I know what I'm doing, Hezade, but you could disappear with us. He didn't look up. I already disappeared. This is just clearing the wreckage. The final thread burned out. The console flickered. then shut itself down. She stood in silence as he pulled a duffel from beneath the floorboard, tossing in what little they could carry: rations, wraps, heat cells, and the child's mask. Callan stepped forward. I won't let you do this alone. He looked up. I'm not asking you to number, you're expecting me to run. Didn't respond. She stepped closer. But I'm not going anywhere unless you're with us. There was a pause, then a nod behind them. Elu stood with her blanket trailing behind her. She looked at Shaw, then at Callan, then patted over, placing a rusted gear into Shaw's palm. He stared down at it. Tau. She whispered. The word struck something deep in him, older than memory. It wasn't just mispronunciation anymore, it was a naming, a choice. Caitlin noticed. She doesn't call anyone that but you. It's just her way of saying no, Callan said softly. It's what she calls the safe one. He looked at her and for once let her see the vulnerability in his face, and then without another word they moved, packed fast, left the workshop dark and bare, a memory sealed in dust. By the time the sweepers arrived, silent, lethal, methodical, they found nothing but old copper wiring and a child's drawing in the grime. 3 stick figures under a circle of stars. The freight lift descended with the groaning weight of history behind it. Callan stood close to the wall, her arm wrapped protective Elia and Elu, who was tucked tightly against her chest beneath the thermal wrap. The child's small hand was curled around the edge of Callan's jacket. She wasn't asleep. Her eyes were open, luminous in the dark, but she didn't make a sound. Shaw stood near the lift's manual controls, one hand on the emergency override lever, his other hand rested lightly on the grip of the weapon strapped to his hip. He wasn't tense, but focused, locked in the kind of stillness that only came from long years of knowing what came next. They said nothing for several floors. The shaft groaned and juddered around them, old gears grinding through decades of dust and rust. The lights above them faded one by one, untiringly. The faintest flicker of blue emergency strip lights remained. Callan finally spoke. How much deeper? To levels. Then it opens into the access well. Shaw said. No cameras, no trackers. They stripped this whole sector for scrap years ago. Why did you choose this place? He glanced at her. Because it was already forgotten. The lift slowed. A sharp clunk rang out as it locked into place. Shaw pulled the lever. The gate creaked open. A gust of stale air rushed in, damp, metallic, with a bite of ozone. The corridor beyond was long and narrow, ribbed with rusted pipe and lined with collapsed bulkheads. Emergency lights flickered in the distance like old stars, ready to burn out. This way, Shaw said, stepping out first. Callan followed, shifting El's weight on her hip. Her boots scuffed softly on the concrete floor, damp with condensation. The air was cold but not biting, survivable. Illustrated slightly. Her hand reached up to rest against her mother's neck, her eyes heavy-lidded. She didn't cry. She hadn't since they left the workshop. Callan kissed the top of her head. She's too quiet. She's watching, Shaw said. She always watches. They moved deeper into the corridor. The walls widened, opening into a chamber strewn with broken crates and old tool panels, a few overturned chairs, a collapsed scaffold. Shaw gestured toward a half-buried door in the far wall. That's it, a supply station, one of the early emergency shelters for they rerouted biosupport. Above, Kane hesitated. What if someone's already taken it? They'd be dead. She raised an eyebrow. There's no airflow in there, no light, nothing but what you bring in. I rigged it to stay sealed unless you know where to knock. He stepped to the door and tapped twice. Pause. Then once more. There was a mechanical groan, then a soft release of pressure. The door slid open an inch. He pushed it the rest of the way and stepped inside. The room beyond was pitch black at first. Then Shaw struck a charge rod against the wall, activating power coils. A low hum followed, and a single dome light flickered to life overhead, illuminating a small room with 2 CDs, a shelf of ancient rations, and a water tank that had survived years of neglect. By sheer miracle, Callan entered, exhaling. You weren't lying. I only lie when I'm out of options. She laid elegantly on the far cot, the child curled on her side, silent, her little chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Lynn sat beside her for a moment, watching. Then she turned to Shaw. They'll still be tracking, I know, he said, rummaging through a storage bin. He pulled out a heat pad and a breather patch. We'll stay here one night, enough to let her rest, then we move again. East sector. I've got an old contact who owes me heaps. A transport under the foundry floor. Callan looked around. You planned all this? Planned to die down here, Shaw said. Then you knocked on my door. Her gaze didn't leave him. And now? He sat down across from her, elbows on his knees. Now I'm rewriting the plan. They were quiet for a long time. Then Callan asked, why didn't you run? He didn't answer at first. There was a girl human about El's age, came through the registry back when I still had a uniform. Her father forged a relocation ID. Sloppy work, it flagged on me screen. My orders were clear. Reject, flag, detain. He rubbed the back of his neck, jaw clenched. I hesitated. A colleague overrode me. They sent them back to the mines. I never saw them. Gankelin stared at him. I thought if I followed the rules, I could fix things from the inside. But the system isn't broken. It's functioning exactly as intended. And now you forge names, she said. No, he replied, now I give them back. Callan's throat tightened. She looked down at the chip still tucked in her coat. Her name reborn, not a sign chosen. Alucal do something before she said Tau. Callan nodded. She thinks that's your name. Shaw smiled. Faintly, it's hers for me. It means something to her. Callan whispered something simple, something safe. Shaw said nothing, just leaned back against the cold metal wall and closed his eyes for a moment. She's not the only one who needed someone safe, Callan added. Thatsilent stretched again, but this time it was warm. Then a sound outside, distant amidal scrape followed by stillness. Callan stiffened. Shaw was already on his feet. Is asleep, Callan whispered. Shaw nodded and moved toward the door, pistol in hand. He opened the panel slightly, just a nod. Peer into the corridor, nothing yet. He stepped back and looked at Callan. They're close. She moved to Elu, covering her in a second layer of cloth. The child didn't stir. Callan straightened. If we have Torin, we won't, Shaw said. But if we do, you carry her. I'll draw them off. She steps forward. I told you I'm not running without you. He looked at her, and this time he nodded. A beat passed, then a faint rustle from outside the shelter, boots scuffing. Damp concrete, maybe 10 moi. Callan reached for Shaw's hand, and for the first time since she'd entered his world, he didn't flinch. He held it not to reassure her, but because she wasn't letting go. Together they waited, no longer prey, no longer alone. Whatever come through that door next, they would face it side by side, not fugitives, but something stronger, a family chosen, bound by trust, not blood, and unerasable. Dawn never reached the depths of Chrism's undergrid. There was no sky down here, no sunrises. Only the gradual shift in temperature and the soft change in air pressure when the city above began to stir. But for Shaw, Callan, and Elu, that morning was something else entirely. It was survival, it was choice, it was the first time they had ever woken into a day they had claimed. Shaw cracked open shelter hatch just enough to check the corridor. The air outside was still but not dead, a silence filled with potential danger but no immediate threat. They're gone, he said quietly. Kay nodded from where she sat with Elu on her lap, brushing strands of white hair away from the girl's sleepy eyes. Elu blinked up at Shaw with the soft, watchful gaze she had carried since the beginning. Kane leaned down and kissed her temple. She didn't cry, she murmured. She didn't need to, Shortblight. He stepped back inside and let the door close behind him with a gentle hiss. They packed in silence, efficient now practice. Callan folded the few remaining heat wraps into a SID sling while Shaw secured the ration pouches and slipped a spare chip reader into his belt. A luckling to Callan's back wrapped in a carrier Shaw had adjusted to her size the night before. You remember the route? He asked. Callan. East corridor cut through the refinery chute. We avoid the upper ducts, use the lift base, not the rail system. Exactly. She met his eyes. Do you think your contact will help us? Shaw paused. He owes me more than a favor. I once rewrote his family into existence. Callan gave the smallest smile. Then let's go. They exited Quita, navigating through broken piping and twisted support beams. The world around them seemed older than it had yesterday, like every bolt, every shadow remembered what had happened and had chosen to remain silent about it. As they reached Junction, Callan spoke without looking back. Shaw, yeah, you still haven't told me your full name. He hesitated. I don't think it matters anymore. It matters, Tom. He exhaled and slowed his pace until they walked side by side. My name was Ha Dion, but it's been dead a long time. She looked over at him, then take it back, shook his head. It was erased for a reason, and yet you're still here. They stopped at the next corner, hidden beneath a fractured support column above them. A soft rumble rolled through, thumping. Another patrol moving overhead, too high to spot them, but it was a reminder they weren't out yet. Shaw turned to Callan. I'm not the same man I was when they stripped that name from me. That man followed rules, watched others suffer, lost his family to a system he helped build. Callan stepped closer. And this man? She asked. He looked at Elu resting against her mother's back, her eyes fluttering closed in the dim light. This man stayed. Callan reached into her coat and pulled out the ID chip he had given her, the one that read Callan Virus. She pressed it gently into his palm. She's not the only one who needs a name, she said. He looked down at the card, then up at her. You're saying I should for Joni? I'm saying, Callan whispered. You've earned one. He turned the chip over in his hand, then slipped it into his jacket pocket. They moved again. It took hours to reach the outer ring of the Foundry District. They stayed low, moved only between shadows. The city throbbed above them, oblivious to the small rebellion occurring beneath its feet. When they arrived at the foundry floor, Shaw led them to a hidden panel beneath the grating. He pried it open, revealing a tunnel lined with scorched lift rail sand, dormant cargo drones. At the far end was an old utility sled, long out off commission, but Shaw knew it still worked. He'd kept the fuel cells hidden under a sealed grate, and no one else knew where it moved fast, refueling and checking the guidance system while Callan held Elu close and adjusted the sling. Shaw turned to them. This is it. Where does it lead out? He said. Past the outer city sector Sindo the marsh corridors. There's a safe place. Small settlement. No scans. No chains. Callan didn't ask if it was real. She trusted him now. He helped her onto the sled, then climbed in beside her, elucidated between them, still silent but warm. As they pulled away from the city's rusting bones, Shaw glanced back once, note in fear, just to mark the place where it had all changed. They rode for hours, no words, just hums of old tech and the sound of the future rolling gently beneath them. When they arrived, it was dusk. The sky was visible here, ash and gray, streaked with pink. For the first time, Milu looked up and reached for it. Callan smiled. Shaw lifted the girl onto his shoulders. Toe, she said, gripping his hair softly. Callan laughed, not with amusement but with something older, gentler relief. She doesn't say it for anyone else. She said she made it up. Shaw said, adjusting her weight. It doesn't even mean anything to her, Callan said, watching them both. It means shum. Weeks later, in a small outpost miles from the city, a woman signed a food registry using her real name. The clerk didn't blink. A child ran past her, blue-skinned, white-haired, chasing a broken drone toy down a dirt path. A man leaned against the fence, watching them, eyes softer than the ones he once carried in the dark. Name? The traveler asked, passing through. Callan looked over. At Shaw. She smiled. Shaw Devrin, she said. He gave my daughter a name and gave me back my voice. Then she added, as Elu laughed in the distance, and I gave him Arison to live, and that was enough. The air smelled of morning rain, not acid wash runoff, or corroded, coolant mist. Real rain, clean, soft, earthy. The kind that kissed the wild grass instead of melting it. Somewhere beyond the settlement walls, water dripped from broadleaf trees into the marshy soil, and the sound reached them like a lullaby. Riding the breeze, Shaw stood outside the small home they'd built into the slope, half salvaged from old transport holes, half assembled with their own hands. The structure still creaked in the wind, and the solar array on the roof blinked uncertainly in overcast light. But it was theirs. It didn't need to be perfect. It only needed to hold the three of them. He was sanding a plank of scrap wood, smoothing it into the side of what would soon be EL's first bed. She'd long since set ground the makeshift cot they'd dragged from the shelter. These days she insisted on climbing down from her mother's sling on her own, toddling around with arms too small for her ambitions and eyes too large for her tiny face. Shaw glanced up and saw her now barefoot, in the wet grass, chasing a blue-winged beetle with determined, tiptoeing steps. Her soft, pale blue skin shimmered faintly in the early light, and her hair, thin, white, and finally long enough to gather into a little tie, bobbed behind her. Callan sat nearby, under the shade awning, stitching patches into EL's worn tunic with gentle, practiced hands. Her sleeves were rolled up to the elbows, her long hair pulled back into a braid. She wasn't singing, but she hummed low the same tune she always returned to when she worked. A Silvani Lalabio Nilu had begun to hum. Back in her sleep, Shaw exhaled quietly and turned back to the wood. It was a good morning. No need for watches, no threat of scanners, no coded knock at the door, no running. Just Wine, the girl, her mother, and a world where his hands could finally build instead of erase. Tau. He looked up. Aganelu was sprinting toward him now, arms stretched out, bare feet slapping the ground, cheeks flushed with effort. She tripped once, caught herself, then reached him, grabbing the hem of his shirt like a lifeline. Shaw crouched instantly. Hey, what is it? She was panting, eyes wide and sparkling. She held something in her hand, a snapped-off beetle wing, translucent and violet. For you, she said. Proud and breathless, he smiled gently, accepting it. Thank you, little storm. She giggled at the nickname. Behind them, Callan chuckled. Under her breath, that beetle never stood a chance. Shaw stood, lifting Elu into his arms. She didn't resist. She curled against his chest like she always did, like that space belonged to her. And no one else. Her tiny hand came to rest over his heart. Fingers spread wide. Good catch, he said, still holding the wing between his thumb and forefinger. Elu tilted her head. I'm brave. Yes, you are, a beat-off silence. Then, with no warning, no hesitation, no warning at all, she looked up and whispered, "Dad?" Shaw froze. Fjord wasn't mispronounced, not like Tao, not like before. It was clear, direct or soft but certain, like she'd been carrying it around for weeks, turning it over in her mind until the time felt right. His breath caught. Callan looked up from her stitching. Her eyes met his. Eludant seemed to notice the stillness. She dropped like a stone into the water. She just nestled closer, her voice muffled against his chest. "Dad, hold me more." Shaw blinked hard once, then swallowed. His voice cracked when he said, "Yeah, of course." He sat down on the half-finished bed frame, Elu still clinging to him, and held her close. Not like something delicate, not like something broken, but like something real. Kane rose quietly and walked over, kneeling beside them. She brushed a stray lock of hair from Elu's forehead, then leaned in to rest her head lightly on Sha's shoulder. None of them spoke for a long time. They didn't need to outside the beetles. Return to the grasses. The clouds parted just enough for sunlight to filter through, bathing the hillside in pale gold. A child breathed slow and steady in her father's arms. A woman leaned against the man who chose to stay and a man who once erased. Names for survival now carried one that had been given not by code or signature, but by a little voice, one that called him dad and meant it.